name is David Thoreau, and I'm the president of the Independent Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to our Independent Policy Forum today. As many of you know, the Institute regularly sponsors programs featuring outstanding experts to address major social and economic issues, especially as they may relate to important new books. And today is no exception. For those of you new to the Institute, you've no doubt found the packet on our program at your seat. The Independent Institute is a nonprofit, non-politicized, scholarly research and educational organization located here in the Bay Area. The Institute regularly sponsors in-depth studies on major social and economic issues. Our program adheres to the highest standards of independent inquiry, and the resulting studies are widely distributed as books and other publications, and are publicly debated through numerous conference and media programs. Our purpose is a Jeffersonian one, of seeking truth to the extent humanly possible, regarding the impact of various government policies, and not necessarily just to tell people what they might want to hear. In so doing, we will not take the public pronouncements of government officials at face value, nor the conventional wisdom necessarily over serious public issues. Hence, we invite your involvement, but be prepared for new and challenging perspectives. The Institute neither accepts nor seeks government funding, but instead draws its support from a diverse range of foundation, business, and individual support. We invite you all to become tax-deductible members of the Institute. In your packet, you'll find information on the benefits that members can receive as far as receiving copies of books and other publications, as well as discounts to programs like this. Our program today could not be more timely. In making this Independent Policy Forum today possible, I want to especially thank the members of our host committee, you'll see listed on the program in your packet, as well as David Packard, for their kind assistance and support. As we all know, with California's current economic despair, we're all concerned, and rightfully so, over what can be done to get us out of this current rut. More than any other nation, America has benefited from entrepreneurial freedom. So whereas in the 1980s, Forbes 400 of so-called wealthiest people in the United States experienced its biggest turnover ever. Going into the 1990s, our growth and prosperity, we believe in California and elsewhere, seems to have stalled. We are truly delighted to be sponsoring our program today for numerous reasons. For 15 years, perhaps more than anyone, George Gilder has demonstrated in his many best-selling books and widely read articles how we can recapture the spirit of enterprise, so essential to human betterment. His book, Wealth and Poverty, created a worldwide sensation, showing how the public good of both economic development and social welfare can only be advanced the social cooperation and individual dynamics of free market capitalism. The book laid the intellectual foundation, the entrepreneurial revolution of the early to mid-1980s, as tax rates were cut and individual enterprise was unleashed, unlike it was in previous years. His subsequent book, The Spirit of Enterprise, shows what entrepreneurship means and its indispensability to human progress. Throughout most of human history, men and women have suffered under the bureaucratic yoke of statism in a seemingly endless variety of forms. As the late Nobel laureate economist F.A. Hayek so cogently described in his brilliant book, Fatal Conceit, each such system falls prey to the fatal conceit of believing now they, some group, through some committee, board, communard, health alliance, or what have you, can ignore the laws of economics and somehow reinvent society willy-nilly the so-called less enlightened masses. To the elite powers of each regime, the populace has been viewed as mere fodder for its own gain, both in war or peace. The masses could not be allowed to make their own choices. And what's more, such freedom was far too dangerous to the elites, for if individual citizens understood that they could advance their own existence on their own, who then would need or tolerate the rulers themselves? Instead of being chained to a recurring series of tyranny, mankind has had a way out. A society not based on state-imposed privilege or dictates, but one based on individual choice, voluntary action, and mutual contracts of consenting parties. It is this system that revolutionized the world, unleashing the natural indigenous market forces of any society, and bringing the populace out of what seemingly was a caste of desperate poverty and disease for millennia. Today, we're witnessing an accelerated worldwide revolution in entrepreneurship, even we hope here in California, despite the best efforts of many local, state, federal officials. Markets are expanding nearly everywhere globally, and the tyrannies of the past are, generally speaking, being forced to retreat. I'm happy to say that both of George's books, Wealth and Poverty and The Spirit of Enterprise, now entitled Recapturing the Spirit of Enterprise, are available in brand new revised editions from our good friends at ICS Press. We have copies for you here. A senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, George Gilder is, as many of you know, editor of ASAP, quarterly high technology supplement of Forbes magazine. He's also a member of the board of advisors of the Independent Institute. He's a graduate of Harvard University. He's been a fellow of the Kennedy Institute of Politics, chairman of Larman Institute's Economic Roundtable, and program director at the Manhattan Institute. In addition to his forthcoming book, Telecosm, George is also the author of Life After Television, Invisible Man, Men and Marriage, The Party That Lost Its Head, which is co-author Bruce Chapman. In addition, he's a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and many other leading publications. So I'm very pleased to introduce him to speak on the subject of recapturing the spirit of enterprise, after which he'll be happy to field questions and perhaps even autograph a few books for us. Introduce George Gilder.
Thank you very much, David. I spent a lot of the morning defending the spirit of enterprise on the Michael Krasny show, was it? Something you have here on PBS in San Francisco. And I came to realize just how relevant this book is. I mean, was completely rewritten a couple years ago, and 4 new chapters were added to it, and all the stories and previous essays in it were updated. So it really is a new book. But answering the questions, coming over the telephone lines to the Krasny show, I realized that the audience of PBS has been living in a different world for the last decade or so. It's a world of poverty and decline and decay, and beset everywhere with problems that are promoted by government into crises, which then have to be solved by new programs. Now, my great theme for the last decade or so, which I have adopted from Peter Drucker, one of the great men of our era, is don't solve problems, pursue opportunities. I just came from Washington, well, flew into Seattle, and I won't give you my itinerary. I can't keep up with it. But in Washington really is the problem center. And they trump up problems into crises and then launch solutions, which collectively represent the one great problematic of the modern era. That is the steady expansion of government, which itself is the fundamental problem, but which they can't solve in Washington. You know, we've had a health crisis, a poverty crisis, an inequality crisis, a trade crisis. Oh yeah, a trade crisis. Clinton's really tough on trade, isn't he? Tanya Harding's strategy for competitiveness. It's, all his advisors have been maintaining for the last 10 years or so that the Japanese would just blow us away in a whole series of areas. Remember the semiconductor crisis. We weren't going to have any semiconductor industry in a few years unless the government intervened and launched some massive effort in favor of semiconductor competitiveness. And, at the time I said that entrepreneurs were solving this alleged problem at the very time they announced it, and that shortly the U.S. would regain dominance in semiconductors. As I said, in 1985, 86, when it appeared that the Japanese were surging ahead. And sure enough, this year the United States, including all our production, is about 10% ahead of the Japanese in semiconductors and microchips. And we're massively ahead in computers, and we're massively ahead in the essential dimensions of telecommunications. The U.S. has, during all these years when crises were being announced every year, the U.S. was pulling decisively ahead in the very most critical areas of the information economy, which really will assure dominance for the decades to come, and have had the slightly unfortunate impact of giving the Clinton administration an opportunity to exercise its cock-a-doodle-doo theory of American competitiveness. You know, the cock-a-doodle-doo theory, you announce that you're going to support all these sunrise industries, and sure enough, the sun does rise, and Al Gore trots over to some fence post and declares cock-a-doodle-doo, and claims credit for it all. And this is the essential strategy that I hope the Clinton administration will pursue, because as long as they do restrict themselves to the Chanticleer role, they won't inflict the kind of profound damage on entrepreneurs which they would aspire to inflict. So all these problems in Washington really are spurious, mostly, except for the one problem, which is Washington itself. And I think that's even true about some of the conservative problems that we cite. I mean, the deficit has actually so bemused a lot of conservative groups that they actually give the impression that the Reagan administration was a time of runaway debt, rather than a miraculous period of huge and unprecedented asset creation. That's what happened during the Reagan administration. In 1979, we had virtually a budget in balance, and we had virtually no trade gap in 1979. But the whole private economy was wallowing in red ink, and most state governments were deep in debt, and state and local and private pension funds were hundreds of billions of dollars in the red in 1979. And during the Reagan administration, there was about a $6 to $7 trillion creation of new assets in all these areas. And pension funds, in ended state and local governments, including California was a great beneficiary. And the fact is that the debt-asset ratios of American business massively improved throughout the 1980s. And the key industries of today, the key companies you read about day after day in the newspapers, were largely financed by the most widely condemned and lamented of all the debt instruments that were introduced during the 1980s, namely the junk bond, TCI, McCaw, Time Warner, Viacom, MCI, all these companies, which are the very foundations of the information economy on which we're embarked for the next decade, the foundations for the information superhighway for which Al Gore will play the rooster, we're all financed by junk bonds, and not just a few junk bonds. I mean, MCI got $2 billion from Milken when it was a $200 billion company, and its goal was to install fiber optic long distance system, the first fiber optic long distance system, at a time when AT&T was projecting fiber optics for long distance sometime deep in the 21st century. And $2 billion of junk bonds financed one entrepreneur financing another entrepreneur, William McGowan, Milken financing McGowan, launched the fiber optic era. And cable TV has become a major U.S. asset. We are the only country in the world that has broadband connections to 60% of its homes. Broadband connections are capable of a full gigahertz, billion hertz of communications. It's some 70,000 times more capacious, these coaxial connections, than the phone company links to homes. And this unique American asset, again, was financed by billions and billions of dollars of junk bonds, $2 billion for TCI alone, Viacom about $1 billion, Time Warner, which at the time was Warner and was in desperate straits as a result of the Atari collapse, got $1 billion. Just all these major companies, and McCaw, which is the key to the U.S. leadership in cellular telephony, which is another major opportunity for the 1990s. McCaw got $2 billion at a critical moment that allowed McCaw to enter cellular telephony. These companies, financed by Milken, are collectively worth $80 billion today, just these ones I mentioned. And they were widely depicted as a Ponzi scheme in many assaults on the greed of the 1980s. So I think that the entrepreneurial upsurge of the 1980s is the key asset for the American economy in the 1990s. And to the extent that it can continue and we don't fall into the trap of policy that I depict in Wealth and Poverty, and in really Recapturing the Spirit of Enterprise has a chapter called Capitalism Without Capitalists. And that's really the kind of capitalism that the administration wants. It pretends to support capitalism, but it's capitalists that it can't stand. This was actually Songus in the last campaign said the trouble with Democrats is that they love employment. It's employers they can't stand. And that really was the perfect insight, because the foundation of economic growth is entrepreneurship. And this book that Vedder and Galloway have written and been published by Independence Institute called Out of Work is directly on target. It shows that throughout all American history, the key force in creating unemployment has been government. And if you think Vedder and Galloway's arguments are perhaps hypothetical or lacking proof, you just have to look to Europe today. In Europe, after decades, when in every political campaign the major issue is jobs, you go over there, jobs, preserving jobs, creating jobs, has been the refrain in every European political campaign for about the last 40 years. And after 40 years of preserving and creating jobs, the Europeans today have unemployment rates that resemble the U.S. during the midst of the Great Depression. The Europeans have long-term unemployment today. That's unemployment for longer than 6 months, 6 times higher than U.S. unemployment rates. And the Europeans have levels of overall employment that's decidedly lower than the United States. And this is the result of government solving problems. They've been solving the unemployment problem in Europe for 30 years, and the result is an unemployment disaster, a real crisis, incidentally, which again derives from this overall problem of excessive government. Well, today I said, don't solve problems, pursue opportunities. I think we do face an unprecedented opportunity, which is uniquely favorable to the cause of human liberty. And that opportunity comes from these very technologies which entrepreneurs have launched and developed over the last decades. They come from technologies of sand and glass and air. Really, remember in the late 1970s, everybody was talking about an energy crisis, natural resource crisis. Well, these technologies are based on the most common substances in the crust of the earth. Literally, the microchip is made of silicon, aluminum, and oxygen, which are the 3 most common substances in the Earth's crust. And they're the foundation of the microchip revolution. And on the radio this morning, everybody wanted to tell me about the environment. Well, these new technologies are mostly subsist on the human mind. And they, as they spread, they almost inherently overcome all the environmental crises that are alleged by these opponents of economic growth that go by the name of the environmental movement. So we begin with this technology of sand. A silicon sliver the size of your thumbnail, inscribed with a logical pattern as complex as a street map of America, switching its traffic in trillions of seconds. Today, it's possible to put about 20 million transistors on a single sliver of silicon and produce it in volume. But within 10 years, or less than 10 years, around the turn of the century, it's going to be possible to put 1 billion transistors on a single sliver of silicon. That's 1 billion transistors. 1 billion transistors is equivalent to the central processing units of 16 Cray YMP supercomputers. Cray supercomputer costs about 20 million bucks. 16 of them would be $320 million. That kind of computing power, 16 Crays, will be manufacturable on a single silicon sliver for under $100 shortly after the turn of the century. This is the most important fact in the world economy today. It's the silicon juggernaut, which is just going to sweep away all the information industries that resist it. Remember the Japanese threat of HDTV? It was an analog HDTV system that the Japanese adopted. When it was introduced a few years ago, I said HDTV is a dog. It's never going to fly. It's sure to fail because of this tremendous rise in the power of digital electronics. Computers will blow away TV of all kinds. And the only reason people are even interested in HDTV, I said, was that it's a dog, and the politician is always the dog's best friend. and that was true then, for the same reason that this entrepreneurial onrush of creativity in semiconductors and computers would just blow it away. And that is happening. But still, the semiconductor itself just provides for separate computers. And it's great. It gives one person at a workstation the creative power of an industrial tycoon of the previous era, but still, it's separate people at workstations. It's, I think of the image of the car in the jungle. If you encountered a car in the jungle, even if you'd never seen a car before, you might find it quite a dazzling technology. Here it has radio, heater, air conditioning, even a loud horn to frighten away fierce animals, bedding, all kinds of stuff. It's a great technology. And encountering this technology, and you might never imagine that the real magic of automobiles comes in conjunction with roads. And it's similarly with computers. For 20 years or so, we used our computers chiefly as cars in the jungle. We used them separately to do word processing and a few other functions, spreadsheets. But we never really understood that the true power of computers, the true computer revolution, only comes when computers are joined together in networks. And that is what's happening today, and that is what produces the real juggernaut of sand and glass and air. Because when the computer technology of sand joins with the fiber optic technology of glass, and the technologies of the radio frequency spectrum of air, that's when you really have the magic of computer technology coming to the fore. And that's just happening today. Between 1989 and 1993, the share of computers in the United States connected to networks rose from under 10% to over 60%. That's just in 4 years. And as these information highways come into line, this is going to endow the computer with new exponential powers, just as the law of the microcosm derives from the proposition that you put any number n transistors on a single sliver of silicon, and you get n squared performance. You get exponential performance measured by the power delay product in semiconductor manufacturing. So, and that's really been the heart of this semiconductor revolution, why it has distributed power around the world, because you get this exponential improvement as you increase the number of semiconductors on a single device. Well, the law of the telecosm is you take any number of computers and you interconnect them on computer networks, and you get any number n computers and you get n squared performance and value. In other words, the value of computers rises exponentially as you interconnect them in networks. And that is going to be the driving force of the world economy for the next decade. Just as the plummeting price of transistors has driven the world economy for the last decade, So the hugely increasing value of computers and the plummeting price of bandwidth, that is, next computers, will drive the world economy for the next decade. And, Adam Smith maintained that the creative power of capitalism derives from the division of labor, the increase in specialization, which drives and expands the market. Well, this is what computer networks are. They're engines of the division of labor. They make it possible for the best people in the world to solve a particular problem together to solve it, regardless of the constraints of geography. This spread of computer networks will spur a huge expansion of economic growth around the world. And once again, all these achievements came despite the collapse of all the major big companies in the computer industry. During the 1980s, all the major big American computer companies either collapsed or finally declined. And what drove this marketplace was the emergence of scores of thousands of new computer and computer software companies. It's this entrepreneurial insurgence that made it possible. And I guess the people on the radio this morning were all convinced that this was really only a revel of greed. But I think that, and they constantly referred to the homeless as sort of a typical harvest of capitalism. And you know, it is a real question. It's a real enigma of capitalism, the reasons for its distribution of wealth that it creates. I mean, why does Harry Helmsley have $1 billion while Harry Homeless sits in a rug in a grave? And all my interlocutors this morning were assured that it was because Harry Helmsley was so greedy. It was the greed of the capitalists that caused the poverty of the homeless. In other words, the fundamental belief that wealth causes poverty. That's really what you can sum up the theory of the left. You know, the belief that wealth essentially comes from stealing. This is a very popular position, both in prisons where I've interviewed and at Harvard. I believe that wealth essentially comes from stealing. Intellectuals want to believe that because it disparages the competitive intellectual class of entrepreneurs. And the people in prison want to believe that because it extenuates their own crimes. But I think that true greed, what greed really is the desire for unearned benefits. And Harry Homeless occupies some of the most valuable real estate on the face of the earth, from the beaches of Santa Monica to the center of Manhattan. And Harry wants to live better than most of the people throughout the history of the world without giving anything whatsoever back to his society. And that's the very epitome of greed. What the entrepreneur does is constantly give back to his society. That's his fundamental principle. His companies survive and prosper to the extent that they respond imaginatively to the needs of others. That's how an entrepreneur prospers. Greed leads as by an invisible hand to an ever-growing welfare state. Because the greedy person, the best way that he can assure unearned benefits is to turn turn to government and have government steal from others to gratify his greed. Greed leads as by an invisible hand to an ever-growing welfare state, to socialism. And the entrepreneur really has to be altruistic in his orientation. The entrepreneur has to understand the needs of others. He has to forego his own appetites to save. That's foregoing consumption. That's what saving is. He has to collaborate with other people. He has to reinvest. And investment is another term for giving. And when you invest, you give to others. You give your resources to others, and you trust them to preserve or increase their value. Giving is difficult. The chief fallacy of socialism is the idea that giving is easy. You just take it from one person and give it to the other and benefit the community. But if all of us know that it is very hard to give without hurting. We encounter this problem all the time with our children, and we encounter it on Christmas season. It's hard to give. It's hard. It takes understanding of others to give successfully. And the true foundation of capitalist success is that it is productive giving. An investment is a truly productive gift. It truly responds to the needs of others and truly helps others. And that is really the heart of capitalist success. So, and it's also the key rule of entrepreneurship, is entrepreneurs don't get rich by taking, they get rich by giving. And if they're chiefly interested in their own consumption, that's the surest sell sign in any company. If you have a CEO who's chiefly interested in advancing his own consumption, you better sell. And it's property rights that link the giving of enterprise to the rise of the capitalist economy. And so the key principle of economic policy is to assure that the same people who create wealth also invest it. Because the best conceivable education for the further creation of wealth is the demonstration of past creation of wealth. The experience, the entrepreneurial experience, allows the entrepreneur to invest effectively, because it joins the two principal yields of enterprise. One yield is a financial profit, and the other yield is a profit of learning, of knowledge. And a capitalist economy is a knowledge system. The reason it prevails is because the same people who create wealth also reinvest it. So the knowledge profit is joined with the financial profit, and that generates new wealth and opportunity for everyone. And it's this foundation of capitalism in the moral order through giving, and in the information economy through the convergence of knowledge and power in enterprise that explains the triumph of countries that pursue the spirit of enterprise. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to answer questions if
do you think that with this computer network bringing all this power, would you say that the most capable people in the country will be able to work together? You expand that on a huge scale. Do you feel that this in time will change the way we govern ourselves in the United States? In other words, how we're represented in Congress, how we might vote, those things?
do think so. I think that, first of all, it means that government will have to earn its way to a much greater extent, because the products of the information era are so hard to measure and tax. The government will have to attract and compete to attract the best people into its purview, and that competition will become increasingly intense as time passes. So I think that, but also I think it will make possible for congressmen not to live in Washington. I mean, this is really absurd that congressmen have to spend their entire time in Washington being acclimated to the Washington culture of socialism. And with true teleconferencing, which will increasingly be possible, it will be a congressman will be able to operate much better in his own district than he could back in Washington. And I think that there'll be lots of Ross Perot's idea of sort of an insta-vote direct democracy is a caricature of the kind of fabric of communication which this technology can indeed offer.
To me, an interesting statement at the start of it, which I hardly agree with, but I think I would like to hear your thoughts on how that can be fixed. Washington itself is the problem. I know. I spent 3 trips there last year, and I came to the conclusion I didn't want to go back to the city again unless it was as a tourist, not as a lobbyist or a business person. What I noticed in the 70-some-odd offices that I visited was that the majority of congressmen and the majority of their aides, people who actually write the policies and laws, graduate from law school in wealthy families. They never had a real job in their life, or else they graduate with degrees in political science, and then they go directly into government at low level, as an administrative assistant to the city council and so forth. Gradually they become congressmen. How can these people know anything about business when they have never filled a real job? Half the time when on every appointment that I go to, I spend half of the time explaining to them how businesses relate, how they're supposed to be, how they get financing, how they produce products, and why something is important before I can get to the issue.
Well, you're completely right, and that's why I think, despite the fact that it does not seem to be, strictly speaking, a conservative proposition, nonetheless, term limits is eminently desirable, and since it's widely popular, I think it should be a major focus of political activism for the next decade, really getting term limits. It really would help.
Okay, but one other thing is that, for instance, we have a race down in my district, Edwards Park. The first thing that the reporters, everybody asks the candidates except for the pop ups, that have been there all along, is not how many votes do you get, but how much money do you get. So it occurs to me that one of the ways to change this would be for the businessmen and people here who really contribute most to the campaigns, who instead of going for a candidate like the NRA or Don Cortese or somebody like this who's been a politician all their life, why don't they back a businessman?
Right. It's true that the businessmen aren't often very good at politics, but it is true that the financing of campaigns is a very important problem, and I think the solution, the real problem, is that rich people are allowed to run themselves, but they aren't allowed to invest in other politicians substantially, and that's this effort to banish money from politics has resulted in PACs, political action committees, dominating the scene, and a PAC is the very definition of a special interest. I mean, they're rich people of all sorts of descriptions. They live in their communities. They have a variety of interests. But a PAC is a monomaniac. The PAC is interested in one thing. How did you vote on my special interest? And that's why the effort to banish money from politics has been so drastically perverse. It's resulted in nobody but rich people being able to run for the Senate in general. I mean, that's the PACs really being able to I think the Clipper chip, this is a requirement that all American electronic equipment contain government-specified encryption-decryption chip called the Clipper chip. And this would indeed be very destructive, not only for the reasons that you mentioned, who wants to buy American electronic goods that contain some this kind of device in it, but also because encryption will be absolutely critical for the next era in electronics, and it's an area of tremendous creativity and development. You know, today, a single CD-ROM can hold 600 big books, or several hundred software programs. And nobody could afford to buy one of these CD-ROMs. They cost between 80 cents and $2 to manufacture. But who could afford to buy 600 books or several hundred software programs? If they'll only be able to distribute this kind of technology over an information superhighway or anywhere else if it's encrypted. And so we need better encryption tools that allow you, which are emerging in a great flourish of creativity, which allow you to give away a CD-ROM and then charge only for the specific use you make of it. When you decrypt a particular article or item, a tag drops into a memory that's tapped over phone lines and debits your credit card. And so you can be given hundreds of software packages or hundreds of books or whatever, and then pay only for each particular use of it. And this will be a tremendous stimulus to the expansion of the industry.
Mr. Gilder, the computers and the efficiencies which come from it as applied to product purchasing seem to benefit consumers. But the entrepreneur is an individual and generally a small businessman who requires higher profit margins as opposed to maybe the entrepreneur who runs NCI. So how do you see this working out in the long run in terms of home shopping network taking money or business away from the small store, the Home Depot, which goes an 800 number nationwide with video input to computers that the small businessman can do? How do you think this is going to come out in the wash?
Well, I think for one thing, I mean, this will be the channel, and it won't be necessarily, will not resemble the existing initial and very primitive representations of it. In other words, a home shopping network is a product of the broadcast era rather than the computer era. And it's really just an extension of catalog sales. I mean, it's essentially you're putting catalogs onto the information highway rather than through snail mail or whatever. And I think the catalogs have an advantage to small businessmen. I mean, there have been just tremendous exploitation of this particular means, and that kind of competition will be extended to the sale of products. And I think, just as just for one market, today the broadcast era means that you have 30 channels maybe, and entrepreneurs promise 500 channels, and this is the choice that will be rendered by the information highway, so to speak. But I don't think that that indeed captures the change that's underway. What's going to happen is the video business will resemble more closely the book business. And rather than having 30 channels or 500 channels, you'll have the kind of creativity that you now see in the book and magazine business. There are 55,000 trade books published in the United States every year. There are scores of thousands of magazines and newsletters. It's an efflorescence of entrepreneurial creativity in the text business today. And what I see is that kind of proliferation of choice that you see in text being extended to video and movies and all these other areas. And I think that is going to happen. And I think it also will greatly improve the quality of the culture. About half the book business, most of the book business is either technical or career or serious books of various kinds. Half of it is religious books. It really does not resemble at all the current video business as you see in broadcast TV in Hollywood.
With the CD-ROM and network technology, hope there evolve eventually what you might call a virtual voucher, where parents can educate their children in networks at home with CD-ROM and completely bypass the public school system.
I'm doing it today. That's what I do. It seems to me that when you can summon to your living room the best teachers on the face of the earth to teach your kids at the pace they need, it becomes less inviting to send them out to stand beside the road in the snow waiting for some bus to take them to some school where they open the day by putting a condom on a banana. Which is actually what happens in New York City. They actually practice in these co-ed groups putting condoms on bananas. Have they introduced that to San Francisco yet?
10 years ago.
Should be popular.
How do you see the Forbes communication network introduced to the workplace? Products are being produced. The selling of products is one thing, but the production of products is where your jobs are continuing. How do you see the benefits of this communication network improving quality of jobs, quality of products, and the overall consumption of products, which is really what you have to do for a particular product?
Well, I think the crux of it is that computer networks eliminate middlemen. That's essentially what they do. They allow people to contract directly with others for the production of goods and services and their delivery. And that means more people devoted directly to the productive activities that remain. And I think it is by making workers productive that you make them employable. And that's what technology does. You link technology to a worker and you make it more productive and thus more employable. This whole idea that employers hire people because they're cheap is completely wrong. Employers hire people because they produce more than they cost. And by the spread of technology, you enhance the productivity and thus the employability of the workforce. And I also think that these kinds of technologies, particularly in the educational side, will overcome many of the problems of our schools and thus make lifelong learning tied to specific productive responsibilities more feasible and more successful. So I think that there's always been the fear that any new technology will displace workers, and it's just a false fear. It's always been a false fear because new technologies generate the wealth that endows workers to perform new tasks. The investment itself, by creating wealth, supplies the antidote to the job displacement. It makes workers more productive and thus more employable is the essence of it.
What do you think about intellectual property? You talked about the importance of property. You talked about how increasingly wealth is the product of mind. What is the role of intellectual property going to play in the future? How is it going to be protected?
Well, I'm very interested in intellectual property since that's all I got. And I think that one of the ways it will be protected is through encryption. Today I write an article and that's the end of it. It doesn't matter whether everybody in the country reads it or whether 3 people read it. I still get compensated the same way. And this is a terribly inefficient way of compensating the holders of intellectual property. And I think that this encryption scheme that I described, whereby you can put hundreds, even eventually thousands of books on a single read-only memory, and encrypt all these articles, and have abstracts that you can read, and all sorts of computer search technologies, and charge people for each time they read one of these articles, each time they decrypt it. You don't charge them much. You don't have to charge them. If you charge them anything at all, you hugely increase the flow of income to the authors over what the current flow is. They estimated it, currently Gary Trudeau makes something like $25 for every newspaper that carries his column for his cartoons for a week. I can't remember what it is, some amazingly small amount of money. But if you just had all the people who wanted to read Gary Trudeau or have it pay a couple cents, Trudeau would make thousands of dollars a week per paper, and it's just that kind of advantage to holders of intellectual property. There are lots of issues of intellectual property, including software patents and a whole array of very tangled issues that I won't address now, but it is going to be a central issue for the next era.
The guy that was on PBS this morning before you was a researcher from Duke University in Forbes, and he studies, he has a laboratory that does Alzheimer's research. And that was the very problem he was explaining about, which is the fact that the research that is done now, when he goes to a medical event, shares the information with other people, experiments immediately, and he no longer has privacy. Now he's playing his card very close to his chest. How does this encourage more interplay between people who are studying the same problem?
Well, it can, and particularly if you can actually enforce the rights to some degree. But it's true that this is information is different from other products. You give it to somebody else, and you also keep it. I mean, it's a different. You both have it, and it's just not clear that very ruthless defense of property rights actually yields the most success. I mean, who would have believed that in the early 80s, when WordStar and a number of other word processing programs completely dominated the field, they were very efficient, they were advancing readily, and yet 3 years later, this new company from Orem, Utah, called WordPerfect, completely dominated the scene. It took about 2 or 3 years, and suddenly they were completely dominant. They did not have a decidedly better product. All they did was say, please steal my program. Please copy WordPerfect. Give it to all your employees. Please spread it as widely as possible. And as a result, everybody bought WordPerfect, but they bought it, and they used it, but they could copy it when they needed to, but they also needed the services and maintenance of the program. So I think it's not clear that sort of complete secrecy and kind of hoarding of your intellectual property is the most successful strategy. But at the same time, I do think that there will be new ways of gaining income from intellectual property developed over the years, and I think that they will be beneficial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Again, we hope that everyone here will pick up copies of George's books, Wealth and Poverty, and also Recapturing the Spirit of Enterprise. And I believe that we might even introduce him, as I said before, in signing a copy of that. So thank you so much for coming and joining with us.